Funding for Current Conversations is provided by University of Oklahoma President's Office, University of Oklahoma Outreach, and World Literature Today. Welcome to Current Conversations. I'm R.C. Davis-Indiano. Today we have 4 segments from shows we've done recently about race and LGBTQ issues in America. The guests, Kathleen Wong, Belinda Biscoe, Kasey Catlett, and Joseph Tai, are some of my favorites for their ability to connect us with important developments in contemporary American society. You'll want to catch each of these segments. Stay with us. In the following segment, Kathleen Wong zeroes in on productive ways to think about race in our everyday lives.
We have always been a country that has struggled with issues of race and ethnicity and sovereignty with Native Americans. And so we've seen, whether it's genocide or it's institutional racism, denial of voting rights, denial of property ownership, all of these type of things that are part of our history have been there. I think in the modern period, we have had more specifically very kind of limited public sort of dialogues and discussions on race. More specifically, they've been limited to race and criminality, race and incarceration, and
with
probably
often the distortion in the media that the people being mainly incarcerated or mainly taking drugs are minorities, and the facts very often just don't support that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And sort of the criminalization of the differential types of drugs based on income, which also coincide with race. And so we have had these discussions, but they've been very, very limited to very specific spheres when you look at sort of mass media and public sort of, perceptions. And I would say probably generally the majority of the United States in terms of white middle class folks thinking about race in sort of relationship to threats to their own safety and well-being. Mm-hmm. And I think that we've entered a period similar to the 60s where now suddenly we have people who are college students, people who aren't the usual people we think about, who are really having a very strong voice on issues of race in a very regular type of way, as well as in ways that are very informed and with a very, very strong voice. And I think that when you look at what's happened with Ferguson, when you looked at what's happening in Baltimore, even as we speak, with the Freddie Gray case, I think that there is this sort of constant awareness, as well as I think a belief that this has been going on, that this is sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. And I think that when we say, it's people have just been angry in the last year and a half, from my own perspective and my communities and the work I've done as well as where I've grown up, I grew up in the Oakland Bay Area. This is not a new story, right? And so we're really now getting to the point where it's become public. And so the awareness is there, but in terms of the reality of what has been happening, it has been there.
I've even seen a reflection of some of this in media from really quite a while ago, maybe 20, 30 years ago. Very often in a lot of Gothic American fiction, like The Shining or Poltergeist or whatever, it turns out that a hotel has been built on a native burial ground, and then there's blood coming from around the elevators. And there seems to have always been these little hints in American culture that too much has been pushed away that relates to race, has to do with slavery, indigenous people. Maybe, or is it possible we're a country of repression? And we've just pushed all that away for too long. And
I think so. Or we've chosen to describe it in this exotic historical trope, right? So that we can't see Native Americans in the modern context as people like you and I, who have similar, economic issues, who have similar aspirations for higher education, who are people, and I don't want to say just like us, but who are people who have very, very similar goals and aspirations and values in life, but also have led very, very distinctly cultural and political lives that are very, very different than other people. Yeah. And so I think that, we tend to be more comfortable historicizing slavery instead of thinking about, for example, contemporary institutional racism. That makes us really uncomfortable. It's harder to see. It's easier in hindsight to look at artifacts, to go to museums, to look at slave narratives.
If we see indigenous people in headdress and really looking like somebody from the 19th or 18th century, that's not really threatening in the immediate way of dealing with somebody who's here and now, a live person.
Right, exactly.
Not an historical phenomenon.
Exactly. exactly.
The other thing I've noticed is, just while we're kind of getting a broad view of all this, just a fear of being made to feel guilty. I hear people talk about it all the time. Oh, I don't want to deal with that racial issue or whatever. You're going to make me feel guilty. That never seems focused in the right place somehow.
Yeah,
Any
yeah.
thoughts about that guilt issue?
So when we look at social psychology and sort of looking at how people understand people whose lives are different in terms of where they are in hierarchical relationships and status, it is often very hard to be the person who is higher in status on a specific social identity, to have empathy for somebody else whose experiences are directly impacted by the experiences of people in my group, right? Because it has these sort of psychological and personal implications for the fact that, as a heterosexual, as someone who's cisgender, for example, what am I doing that's also, not helping with this situation? And so I think that that's where we go. I think that what we want to do is to sort of say, yes, so you have that guilt, and I'm not denying that people shouldn't have it. I don't think we ever want to say people shouldn't feel what they want to feel. But I think that what we need to do is to stay engaged so that we can work through that and gain some insight, right? So to gain some insight about what does that mean in terms of my relationship then to other groups, right? So we inherit these systems of relationships that we had nothing to do personally with creating, right? I had nothing to do with creating the system of heterosexism, but I live in it. I benefit from it. I can reinforce it. I can pretend that if I do nothing, that I'm actually not hurting people, but in fact, I'm not resisting it. So there's things that I think that we need to sort of think more carefully. I think it's okay to have emotions. I think Americans are generally pretty fearful of having emotions and affect about race and racism. I think that
Just part of the Puritan ethic and the culture, fear of emotions and nervous about the body and hygiene and sexuality and death and everything else.
I suppose, I think that I think that, I think that when people show their strong feelings about issues like discrimination, it's hard to sort of hang on to those emotions and feel like you have control, over your intellect and over the things that you would like to, the ways in which you would like to present yourself. So there's this phenomenon called aversive racism, right? There's also aversive homophobia, aversive classism, aversive sexism. And so it's this sort of, where we take up some of our mental space because we are concerned that people might think that we're racist. And so even as a woman of color teaching white students, for example, in the back of my mind, I might be sort of worried that I hope these students don't think I don't like them because they're white. I hope that, so it actually ends up reducing some of our cognitive capacity when we actually need it, right, to engage in these very complex issues. So I think that these things are things that happen to everybody. And we need to be a little more willing to stay engaged, but also to allow people who want to disengage.
In the following segment, Belinda Biscoe tries to put race in the broader picture of American culture and civil rights. Enjoy this brief exchange.
For me, despite my youthful appearance, I grew up in the Deep South in Atlanta in the days of segregation and Jim Crow laws. And so some of these issues are very near and dear to my heart. I had both the opportunity and the misfortune in some ways of being the first African American to be involved in a number of things as a young teenager in Atlanta. For example, I was homecoming queen at my all-segregated high school when I was a senior, and that year the state of Georgia decided to have an interracial football game, and it was the first football game in the history of any high schools, a black high school, to play a white high school in football. Naturally, the football is historic. That event was at the white high school, and when my group arrived, when my high school classmates and I arrived to the white high school, there was literally a police officer on every bleacher, every end of each bleacher with a cocked rifle. Wow. I mean, it was probably the most quiet football game I've ever been to.
Oh my gosh.
No student, whether you were black or white, made one noise. I also had the opportunity to be with the first cohort of teens who were selected as teen models in Atlanta, because prior to that time, no African American young female had been selected by the department stores to model, because what people said was there are no African American girls beautiful enough to be models for our department stores. And so I had to deal with a lot of the what we call micro or subtle aggressions where white girls would say things. I remember one night working with another young white teen whose uncle was the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in Atlanta, in Georgia. And she said to me after we became friends, she said, "Belinda, you know, I realize now after getting to know you that nothing my uncle has told me growing up about blacks is true. You're nothing like what he told me black people were like." So I think at a very young age, I worked in the inner city registering African Americans to vote, often signing X's for people who were illiterate and could not read or write. So I think at a very young age, I committed myself without maybe doing it in a conscious way to deal with some of the social injustices. And I think at a very young age, I also decided that despite the inequities that were imposed upon me, not being able to have access to so many things in the culture, that I could find ways to make a difference that didn't reinforce the negative, oppressive ways I was exposed to in the South.
People watching this, I think, are going to ask themselves the question, what can I do in my life? What can I do in my job place? How can I make a difference as an individual? What would you say to somebody who asked that question?
My answer would probably be this. I think one of the problems, and it probably isn't going to deal directly with your question, but indirectly, is that we focus too much on hit and miss approaches to dealing with this problem. I think we've got to be honest as a country about looking at all the systems and coming up with multiple strategies across the systems. What should the public school system be doing at a very young age to bring kids together, to accept and embrace each other, to collaborate, to work together across race, gender, sexual orientation, whatever the differences that may divide us? What's the role of higher education, and how do we purposely do things? Families. I am convinced that families need to do more. When I see things projected out there by young people sometimes, I often believe that there have been these very negative conversations in families. The parents or guardians wouldn't act out on this, but then their children have internalized this and they act out on it, and the parents
They don't know any better.
They go, "Oh my goodness, my child committed this horrible." But children are very malleable. They're learning. They're taking in all of these things.
Joseph Ty has been an important player on the legal side to protect the rights of the LGBTQ community. Enjoy this conversation.
Schools generally have a duty to protect and to keep kids safe, and that's against bullying, whether it's on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, and now on the basis of sexual orientation. School administrators cannot make that distinction to allow kids to be beat up for one reason but not for another reason. And so I do think here that the law can provide that protection for the kids. But again, I mean, you don't want to get into the situation where the law is your first rather than your last resort. You hope to put the child in a safe place where they can feel welcome and where people around them can support them, rather than to come in after the fact with the lawyers.
But in an extreme situation, the fact is there's liability the school has, and there's some real legal
So
remedies here.
You can proactively educate the school administration and the school board that, hey, look, you have a duty to protect all of your students, and here are some of the policies and best practices around the country for doing that. And there are national groups as well as statewide and local groups that will provide you, with these best practices and policies and programs to provide the kind of tolerant environment and protective environment where LGBTQ students feel that they're safe, and if they have problems, that there there are avenues that there are people they can go to, there are places they can go to for support and for assistance.
I know that it's a dramatic step for people very often to go to a lawyer. They're afraid that they'll set in motion a legal process that once it's happening, it's really hard to sometimes stop it. Are there interim people where somebody could go and seek some kind of remedy, somebody that could mediate, maybe speak with the legal folks and speak with the school and speak with the parents and work out something that's short of ending up in court?
Oh, I think drawing in LGBTQ groups around the state or in the local area and getting them to help educate the administrators and the school board is a good first step. I think getting other parents involved as well, because ultimately the school administration is responsible to the school board and the school board is responsible to the parents. And so I think a good first step is just to educate and make the school board and the administration aware of these issues and of the potential legal problems down the road in order to avoid them.
Isn't it true, though, and I think I've seen this, that sometimes lawyers really can be very effective doing that. There are lawyers who aren't just trying to go to court, and they can step in and say, look, we've got some concerns here. You don't want to end up in court. Let's talk. Let's work this out. So a skillful lawyer could be that intermediate person as well.
Oh,
right?
Certainly. And Atticus Finch is not just not just someone who's effective in court, but someone who avoids getting into court. And I think nowadays, given the crunch in school budgets and given concerns about lawsuits and the kind of reaction they would engender across the country, I think any sensible school administration would want to proactively solve these problems.
Okay, what's the legal landscape? I think we all have kind of an inkling of this, but how would you? What's the legal landscape on civil unions and same-sex marriage?
Well, the Supreme Court has clearly affirmed that there's a constitutional basis for gays and lesbians to marry, and so as a result, they can get married anywhere in the country, and their marriages must be recognized everywhere in the country. But the Supreme Court and lower courts have not sorted out all these subsidiary issues that could flow from that, including, what about divorces? Is there a fundamental right to that as well? What about the rights of the children that are involved? And of course, the big elephant in the room is private discrimination. You can go over to the courthouse and get married and then cross the street and get fired or not get served. And those issues will need to be sorted out, I think, first socially before they get sorted out in the courts, if they need to eventually go to the courts, and hopefully they won't.
Aren't there pockets around the country still, though, even after the Supreme Court ruling, where the folks in the state house or whatever, where you get a license, they're just not going to cooperate, or they're going to be passive aggressive about it?
Just a couple of years ago, there was a judge in Louisiana who refused to marry an interracial couple, right? So you're going to get pockets of resistance like that around the country, I think, for a long time. But I think remarkably, at least with marriage equality, most of the majority of the country, I think, has started to accept, if not embrace, the fact that marriage equality is right as a moral matter, if not also as a constitutional matter. And hopefully we'll see the same tide turning quickly with not just respect to marriage, but also with respect to how we treat one another.
It sounds like you're counseling patients. In other words, the law of the land is what it is, and now we're going to go through that process of social re-equilibration. There's a new reality, and it's not going to happen overnight.
But I think there's a legal component to that too, which is that instead of litigating these rights in court, why don't we go to our neighbors, our friends, and as well as our legislators. For example, in Norman, I think there's a movement now for the city council to recognize that our current protections on gender discrimination should be interpreted to protect LGBTQ. And I think if anyone here in the community cares about equality, both in the public sphere as well as in the private sphere for their friends and families, they should attend those meetings.
Kasey Catlett is on the front lines working with LGBTQ young people to understand who they are and how they relate to the world around them. Enjoy this conversation. I'm imagining that our audience today is made up of parents or people who care about young folks who are going through difficult transitions. Kasey, could we start with you? What does a young person go through as they're coming out, realizing who they are in terms of their gender orientation? Is it a process? Is it just a sudden revelation? What happens?
Well, when it comes to their sexual orientation, then it's typically a process that happens. Starts at a really early age, and most of the time at the beginning stages of it is through comparisons to their friends or family members, realizing that we're in a world that's very heteronormative, basically meaning that the assumption or that we're socialized as all being heterosexual. And so when you're not, and because we're not born with vocabulary, that you compare yourself to other people, realizing that, oh, I'm not like the other boys on the playground or like the other girls, or you see the binary with mom and dad or something like that, and that doesn't necessarily fit for you. So that first kind of process is realizing that I don't fit that heterosexual identity. So then what is my identity?
I would think too that a real difficulty is that the mom and dad who can jump in and help on almost everything else may not know a lot and have any firsthand experience. So that must be hard for the young man or woman to look to their parents and not get the support that so often is there, right?
Absolutely, and it really comes down to that, well, if I'm looked at or I feel different, so is there something wrong with me? And if because I don't see representation or I don't know anybody else who feels the same way because it's not talked about, so if I go to mom and dad, are they going to be upset with me? Will something happen if I tell them this is how I feel or there's something different about me?
Okay, so what can a mom or dad, or a good friend, somebody who cares about this young person, what are some best practices that you could tell us?
I think some of the best practices is silence is a message on its own. So if it's not talked about, then you're sending a message that it's taboo. So identifying as LGBTQ is taboo. So if you're having the conversation or you're recognizing that there are different types of sexual orientations, different types of family dynamics, things like that that are out there, then it starts the conversation that it's very open and fluid. And so then they can recognize that, okay, this is a little bit like me, and I can kind of go off of that. And it allows the child to ask questions. And children are very curious and inquisitive, and so they're going to ask questions, but you have to give them that space to do so.
Kasey, it's something I've got to ask you about because I know this comes up in various parts of the country, particularly very conservative communities. Conversion therapy, that's going to occur to a lot of parents. Oh, well, maybe I should get them in counseling and maybe be a little more aggressive and get them in conversion therapy, and that's going to somehow help get them going in the right direction.
The beginning piece of that is that you're assuming that there's something wrong with the child if they identify as LGBTQ and that there needs to be some sort of conversion, and that's problematic. So, and then going further into that is that the American Psychiatric Association has already made a very staunch claim saying that it's very detrimental to individuals and it doesn't work. So there's no point in doing that. In fact, it's considered in a lot of large areas and communities that it's torture. And so by doing that, you're actually not fixing anything. You're causing more problems with mental health issues, suicidal ideation.
So if you want to make your son or daughter's life even more difficult, even more stressful, try to go to the conversion therapy way, and you're probably causing a lot of problems.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we've got this young person past the coming out stage. Okay, the person's still pretty young. They're in school, and you discover that your son or daughter is being bullied or in some ways being mistreated in relation to being LGBTQ.
Oftentimes, and we're seeing a cultural shift now, but even at the age of being in K-12, that they're not officially or they haven't self-identified yet. And so a lot of bullying comes from perceived and actual sexual identity.
So the parents got to try to sort out what's actually happening, what might be just perception.
Absolutely, and it could very much be perception where bullying comes into play. So if you're seeing where signs where the child does not feel the most authentically themselves, if there's issues that come into play where grades are dropping, things like that, that might be a factor. I'm not saying that's a factor for all students or all children, but that is a common thing. So when recognizing that if the child isn't feeling authentically themselves, then that's going to be a big piece of it.
You know, I'm a parent, and you just always debate with yourself, should I jump in? Am I going to look like a helicopter parent if I do this, or should I stay back and let things just work out? I mean, what's the best advice for a parent when they think there might be? Should they just jump in a little bit and get more information? Or?
Well, anytime that there's discrimination policies or discrimination towards a student, then you want to jump in because we would like to think that all administration and teachers are going to be perfect and always advocate for the child in that situation, but we know that there's a lot of homonegativity that's out there, even within the school districts towards LGBTQ identified students. So if the parents can advocate for their children, then that's always a good place to go.
So we've got a somewhat older person now, maybe is gone off to college or is in a work environment and is having trouble, I'm thinking kind of a spectrum here. Maybe it's a chilly environment where they just don't feel accepted, or they just haven't been able to, at the other side, pull a support group together. Thoughts about that situation?
Well, and that's the important piece to remember, is that the coming out process is not a one-time moment. It's an ongoing thing, especially when, in a world where, again, heteronormative, that in any new situation, you're going to inevitably have to come out. So when you're in a new environment like that, then you kind of have to feel out the landscape or the cultural environment of that area, and then find, which we do in all aspects, find individuals that you feel comfortable with, that you can, confidentially share that information, and so that there is support there, that you're not in a place that it could be hostile.
Is maybe the advice for a parent to not, try not to cross that line where you become a helicopter parent where you're just involved with everything. But I think you're saying stay connected. Absolutely.
And then this is a huge piece of it going into college, that now we're seeing a trend where students are coming out earlier and earlier before they even step on college campuses, which has not been the case historically, where they've waited till college or even after college to come out. So that changes the whole landscape of a university or in any kind of higher education institution, where what are we doing, how do we look from the outside in to parents and also potential students who are coming in? Are we LGBTQ friendly? Are we welcoming and affirming? Do we have programs? Do we have advocacy? Do we have education? Is there a sense of community? And that's what students are looking at.
That's what we have time for. I am so glad that you could be with us. Join us next time for more current conversation. Thank you for watching.